Okay, so here I'm going to go through a summary of my first work, actually, from Martin Van Buren to Joe Biden, Debunking the Magical Switching Parties Conspiracy Theory. And this work led me to doing the other ones about busting the three narratives and then the playbook, because you see one thing and then from that you see another, and from that you see another. So here goes. Okay, the reason the reason Democrats think it's okay to deplatform conservatives or get them fired or kick conservative friends and family out of their life or violently assault conservatives or weaponize the law and corporate policy against them. There's a reason it took off under this generation of Democrats. And that reason is the magical switching parties conspiracy theory. They believe you're the latest in a 400-year chain of oppression. Now, ordinarily, one would instill some hesitancy among rabid Democrats by pointing out who actually did all that, who actually did all the slavery and the Jim Crowing. But you see, millennials are the first generation to have heard in school and their entertainment and the so-called news that the parties switched. In other words, the magical switching parties conspiracy theory is the lie that turned millennials liberal. It's a cover story for victimhood LARPing and self-congratulation. It's a ready-made excuse to shut down listening and turn off conversations that make people uncomfortable because proving that social policies based on self-congratulation don't work in real life can make liberals very uncomfortable indeed. This parties switched lie wasn't in history curriculums prior to the late 90s and early 2000s, so as a byproduct, it hasn't been on the radar of many middle-aged or older conservatives who imagine that a revival of socialistic thought is alone enough to explain millennial enthusiasm for Democrats, and this leads old-timers to do tone-deaf things like announce they're Reagan conservatives or how much better, Reaganism was than socialism. And, well, guess what? The young uns were told Reagan was a racist who refined Nixon's Southern strategy, who rounded up white working-class voters, not because Jimmy Carter's economic policies had failed, but by using secret racist coded dog whistles. So, the harder you push and say that we need, more Reagan or more, the old-fashioned this, that, and the other, the more they're running away from you, and there's a reason. They've been told by their teachers and favorite entertainers, essentially, that you're all bad people. And quite bluntly, no one cares what you think the marginal tax rate you should be. What you think no one cares what you think the marginal tax rate should be until they're convinced you're not a Nazi. And there's no way to really win this argument playing defense, trying to explain away every fake bombshell and misquote. It's kind of a fool's errand. When people hear 20 fake accusations against you spun as history or a pattern, they're not going to check all 20. They're probably going to just split the difference, conclude some are true, conclude you're a bad person, and vote Democrat. There's really only one way out of this. You have to expose the accuser's lack of moral authority, to move the discussion to the Democrats' sordid past, to name the inventors of the magical switching parties conspiracy theory, take people like Arthur Kroc and Joseph Alsop and Jack Bass and Walter DeVries, Alexander Lammis, Edward Carmines, James Simpson, Dan T. Carter, Earl and Merle Black, Joseph Eistrup, Carrie Fredrickson, and Kevin M. Cruz. Make them household names and lay out the timeline of this conspiracy theory's invention and evolution, as, of course, in this work I do, among other things. I also have a more detailed work on the origins of every little detail of this I'm still working on, but the important thing is with this you can debunk the conspiracy theory of the party switching itself, which is what you need in the short term. First of all, the American founding wasn't the problem here. These were, the Democrats can't just say, oh, we inherited this bad thing. No, they took something that was on its way out, if anything, and made it come back with a vengeance. So the founders, these are basically the first people to seriously question the morality of slavery itself. Now, of course, no one ever wanted to be a slave, but questioning the institution itself was a fairly recent development. Indeed, per Brown University historian Gordon Wood, quote, "The revolution suddenly and effectively ended the cultural climate that had allowed black slavery, as well as other forms of bondage and unfreedom, to exist throughout the colonial period without serious challenge," end quote. Other historians, Elizabeth Fox Genovese and Eugene Genovese, further pointed out, quote, "Perception of slavery as morally unacceptable, as sinful, did not become widespread until the second half of the 18th century," end quote. Now, as many before me have pointed out, and we'll deal with this in passing because most of this isn't about 1619 because they don't really deal with it. They just try to, take America and slime the whole thing. But anyway, as they've pointed out, as many before me have pointed out, rather, the 1619 project is nonsense. The 1772 Somerset decision applied only to the British Isles, alarmed no colonists, and only a handful of American colonial newspapers even mentioned it. The British Caribbean didn't fear impending abolition either, and why should they, when no British abolitionist movement organized until 1783 after the war? That'd be the likes of William Wilberforce. The Society for the Effecting of the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in 1787, 4 years later. Compounding this, British loyalists in North America and elsewhere owned slaves too. So the chasm between rebels and crown wasn't over slavery, and Governor Dunmore issued his proclamation after the war began. It applied only to the rebel slaves, most of whom promptly got shipped to the Caribbean plantations, or if lucky, merely resettled in Nova Scotia, in Canada. The 1619 hoaxers, they don't cite any person and they don't cite any document to support the idea that the war was to preserve slavery. They never explain why the more slave-intensive Caribbean colonies didn't join the American Revolution, which is inexplicable if trying to preserve slavery motivated this fight. The founders' thinking chiefly focused on creating and preserving free societies by inquiry into the proper role of government. They seldom really mentioned race at all, insofar as any held racist views. Said views were no worse than any of their contemporaries, very often not as bad, and incidental rather than central to their philosophy, and any pronouncements simply don't match the virulence and the vitriol of what's seen from Democrats later, nor did the Founding Fathers ever create any organizations to terrorize free blacks like the Ku Klux Klan. The oft-mentioned 3/5 compromise was not a verdict on the humanity of blacks. It was a verdict on allotting representatives, absent which the slave power's clout would be even greater. Motivating the compromise, Great Britain loomed, a potential threat to reconquer the former colonies if they were disunified, and as British forces occupied and burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812, this danger was not a hypothetical danger at all. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territories, which contained the future states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. In 1780, legislation banned Americans from employment or investment in the slave trade. In 1794, Congress barred American ships from the slave trade. In 1808, Congress bans the importation of slaves. By 1804, every state north of Maryland had abolished slavery. Now, how did all this occur during the lifetime of the founders if our founding ideas were truly just white supremacy? Anti-slavery societies flourished even within the South. Preachers and printers critiqued the institution unmolested. Even many planters paid lip service, at least, to the idea that slavery should end someday sooner rather than later. Yet by 1860, the planters were willing to fight a war to preserve slavery. Clearly, something had changed after the founding in ways incompatible with our founding. If our founding was white supremacist, the South in 1860 ought to resemble the founding more than other parts of America, yet it doesn't. From male censorship to speech and gun control to the rejection of Jefferson by John Calhoun, George Fitzhugh, and Alexander Stephens with the Cornerstone speech, the South drifted from the founders. The founders inherited slavery from the British and curtailed it. The Democrats inherited this diminished institution and compounded it and expanded it and fought a war to preserve it from abolition. So the Democrats can't just pin this on the founders. They can't say, oh, we inherited it from the founders. No, you inherited something that was declining and then revived it. As historians Eugene Genovese and Elizabeth Fox Genovese tell us in The Mind of the Master Class, 2005, page 73, the early 1800s South had over 100 anti-slavery societies and tolerated denunciations of slavery. And as Winthrop Jordan writes in White Over Black, 1977, page 346, manumissions of slaves enjoyed toleration as well. Historian John Blassingame writes in The Slave Community, quote, until the 1820s, many planters, convinced of the immorality of bondage, joined with clergymen in seeking its abolition. And it's in his book, The Slave Community, 1979, page 77. Yet Stanley Elkins, historian, remarks by the 1830s, quote, the hostility to slavery that had been common in Jeffersonian times, ... had all but disappeared, end quote. Stanley Elkins, Slavery, 1976, page 209. Returning to Blassingame, in the slave community, planters organized a campaign to defend slavery. They organized mobs attacks on anti-slavery ministers. Quote, by the 1840s, propagandists had largely succeeded in silencing the churches, end quote. That's from his book, Blassingame, in his book, The Slave Community, 1979, pages 80 and 81. And then the Democrats browbeat local clergy into shilling for slavery. and this leads to a whole lot of the things that the Southern Baptist Convention has issued apologies for in some recent years. That's how all that came about. A huge role was played in all this by perhaps the most important person you've never heard of, or maybe you've heard of him and seen streets named after this guy, but most people don't put much thought into this guy, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren headed the Albany Regency political machine. He was allied with the New York City Tammany Hall machine. In 1822, he went to Virginia and met Thomas Ritchie, member of the influential Richmond Junto. He was editor of the paper The Richmond Enquirer, which is basically a shill paper for planter interests at the time. He proposed an alliance, and we know this meeting happened because Ritchie wrote about it. Yet Ritchie, at the time, declined Van Buren's scheme. Undaunted, Van Buren made a second trip in the 1826 Christmas season, meeting John C. Calhoun in Virginia. They forged an agreement. Van Buren wrote his 1827 letter to Ritchie spelling out the deal. Thomas Ritchie's allies, per this deal, would back Van Buren in general, and Van Buren's allies would block any attempt to end slavery. Per Van Buren, quote, political combinations between the inhabitants of the different states are unavoidable, and the most natural and beneficial to the country is that between the planters of the South and the plain Republicans of the North, end quote. Without said alliance, quote, the clamor against Southern influence and African slavery would increase, end quote. The quote's from Robert V. Remini, Martin Van Buren, and the Making of the Democratic Party, published 1959, pages 131 and 132. And the plain Republicans he speaks of are the people who were the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. When they're called Democratic Republicans by present historians, that's really a shorthand to not get them confused with modern Republicans. Back at the time, they actually just called themselves either Jeffersonians or Republicans. But there is no connection between this party and the modern GOP. Anyway, most people involved in the first organization would simply have just died in the meantime by the time you get to 1854. Anyway, the clamor of the against Southern influence in African slavery would increase. Okay. Increased clamor mattered. Overseas immigration to northern states reduced Southern electoral clout. Van Buren made the planters an offer they couldn't refuse, to use his political machines to dominate the North in order to protect slavery from the growing free state power. The backdrop of the Missouri Compromise showed rising northern will to do it, and absent dividing the North against itself, it was very likely slavery was going to be abolished. So they formed an organization to further this deal. It's called the Democratic Party. Now, Van Buren wasn't personally pro-slavery per se, as much as he just wanted the argument to go away, because he thought it was going to result in disunion or war, and he thought that by having the Democrats suppress the issue, he'd prevent this, which didn't really work too well. The cotton gin, as much as people talk about, the cotton gin is why slavery persisted. Well, no, that's actually not true at all. And here's why. The cotton gin makes slavery profitable, but does profitability keep something from being abolished? No, only political clout can keep something from being abolished. Okay, it's the Democrats who are responsible for keeping slavery going to 1860, not the cotton gin. The cotton gin doesn't reverse decades of slavery's... let's put it this way. The cotton gin doesn't make things like the positive good school of the positive good theory of defending slavery. The cotton gin doesn't raise armies like the Confederacy. The Democrats do. The cotton gin doesn't do none of that. The resultant Civil War is also not really widely... it's widely misunderstood in a lot of ways, in a way that it was not misunderstood at the time. Kids today learn it was a war between the North and the South. It was not. It was a war between Republicans and Democrats. Northern Democrats did everything they could to impede Lincoln from effectively fighting the war. They were called Copperheads, and I don't know how typical this is of most people's schoolings, but in all my schooling, I heard them simply described as Northerners who didn't want to fight the war. I never heard them described as Democrats, even though that's the most important factor in why they did what they did. Now, Northern as well as Southern Democrats were complicit in this fight to preserve slavery. Their only split was on strategy. Southern Democrats thought secession was the best way to do it. Northern Democrats didn't. But it was a split on how to best preserve slavery. Neither one disapproved of slavery. And Lincoln's apparently flip-flopping and waffling on slavery is actually, it doesn't prove he's a bad dude, as 1619 would try to spin it. It proves he's trying to make sure he didn't lose re-election. He won in 1860 in a four-way contest. In 1864, he very greatly feared he was going to lose as late as September. A bunch of timely military victories in late September and early October is really the only thing that got him over the finish line. Yeah. So basically, to win in 1864, he had to win a number of swing states like New York, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And the last three had a lot of Southerners moving westward that settled them. Basically, you go south of US 40, give or take. Basically, Virginians moving westward settled the lower half of those Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. If you ever go down there, they sound like Southerners, and there's a reason. But yeah, at the time they were heavily Democrat, and if he did anything that provoked a really high turnout from them, he would lose 1864, and slavery would continue. So yeah, of course, with the whole Emancipation Proclamation, there essentially came a point where he decided he had to go for broke, that plus some handy military victories did get him over the finish line in 1864. Now, of course, all this is omitted by the 1619 Fake History Project, of course. I mean, plus, if Lincoln had wanted to save the Union, regardless of slavery, he would have just embraced the Crittenden Compromise at the start of his term. Or embraced Stephen Douglas's ideas of popular sovereignty. I mean, he didn't. He could have, and he didn't. So, I mean, this is something where we have a litmus test to know, and the litmus test matches my interpretation and not the 1619 interpretation. After the war, Democrats, South and North, defended slavery. Those opposing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were Northern Democrats. The South wasn't yet readmitted to the Union. Only 23% of Democrats supported abolishing slavery. Mind you, Northern Democrats. Other amendments had 0 Democrat votes. To address some canards, no, those Democrats weren't conservatives. Post-war Democrats did things like creating regulations like the black codes, requiring annual employment contracts, prohibiting movement between counties without official permission. I mean, is this Soviet Russia or something? By employing vagrancy charges against people who were between jobs looking for a better one. So this anti-market mentality motivated hefty license fees on out-of-state recruiters trying to offer freedmen other work. You also have things like occupational licensing that they were, which is affordable for the existing professionals, but tried to block black entry into many skilled trades. And then, of course, in the meantime, legislators could all plead the law it's neutral if they challenged it in court. And, of course, gun control laws upheld all the above. I wonder which party still backs that. Democrats invented political racism. Obviously, racism precedes the existence of the United States, much less the Democratic Party. But racism as a method for turning out votes, obviously that can't be older than places where people vote. Most of the places where people voted prior to America were, like ancient Greek city-states or like Republic of Venice or Genoa or like, Holland. Obviously mono-ethnic. So, yeah, I mean, some of it's just the fact that the Democrats were the first to be in a multi-ethnic or multiracial country where people voted, but all the same, they could have just not invented it, and they did. So the Democrats invented political racism, held the party together. They founded the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan initially targeted white Republicans, then pivoted to blacks, who were more easily identifiable as Republicans. And the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 restricted northern Democrat inflow of money and weapons to the Klan. The Grant administration created the DOJ. Its first task was to suppress the first Klan. As for its revival, Thomas Dixon, a Democrat, later appointed to a judgeship by FDR, he wrote a book called The Klansman. D.W. Griffith, there we go, based Birth of a Nation on it. Worth noting, the film ends with the Klan protagonists defeating carpetbaggers, and then the caption card, because it's a silent movie, says, "Disarming the Blacks." So, yeah, gun control laws. upheld white supremacy. That may be the only accurate thing in that movie. But yeah, it does end with disarming people. Another thing, Republicans in 1876, they didn't sell out or stop caring about black rights. Rather, they lost 1874 so badly, Democrats held the House of Representatives and out-leveraged them in the post-1876 drama. And as for Jim Crow, that started in the 1890s, not in 1876. There's a reason Democrat retellings want to shoehorn Jim Crow's start date back into 1876, though, because Jim Crow was actually installed 1890 through 1920, this nadir of American race relations. Now, that overlaps with another thing, 1890 to 1920, the Progressive Era. Yes, the nadir of American race relations was the Progressive Era. You might want to look into the Progressives. You'll be astounded how racist they were. It wasn't just Woodrow Wilson, and to be clear, they were racist above and beyond the general level of racism at that time. And then there's the matter of what Jim Crow was. It wasn't simply permitting private discrimination. It was government-mandated discrimination. Jim Crow was big government. Also, during this time, Woodrow Wilson basically invented the living document interpretation. Imagine if voters knew that the living document interpretation of the Constitution was the work of the guy who segregated the federal government and revived the Klan. So also, this all continues with FDR. He took the Tammany political machine playbook to the Potomac, essentially becoming America's first national machine boss, winning 4 terms easily. The Democrats gained the black vote in the 1930s over economic issues. By January of 1935, over 3 million blacks worked on relief projects and began switching to the Democrats. That's from Sam Lovell, White and Black, Test of a Nation, 1966, page 57 and 58. Civil rights played no part in why they became Democrats, unless one thinks that FDR's vetoes of anti-lynching bills counts as support for civil rights. By the way, these vetoes were sustained by Northern Democrats backing their party. Northern Democrats are complicit. This is not just those Southerners did something. The Depression gutted the private sector, and the federal government became the leading black employer by 1935, which Democrats leveraged for votes. And then there's the Northern Democrat unions that wouldn't accept blacks as members. Northern Democrats were complicit. It's not Southern guilt. It's Democrat guilt. It's all Democrat guilt, start to finish. Republican success at passing the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments occurred when they had overwhelming structural advantages, such as with Southern Democrat states not readmitted to the Union, or when they went to the ratification at the state level, they were under Union Army occupation to ensure everything was being done on the level. The Southern states were then back in Democrat hands, by hook or by crook, and mostly crook, if we're being honest. Democrats could effectively prevent most further improvements and greatly impede enforcement of what already existed. The only constraint on Democrats is that they couldn't do something so bold it would reinflate Northern swing voters to back Republicans into doing more, like reoccupying the South. The Republicans neither lost interest nor lost their principles. Rather, they lost elections and lost court cases. And besides, if the GOP record, properly understood in context, was really that bad, why are Democrats trying to claim it while assigning the GOP their old Democrat record? In passing, you did periodically have Republicans who called themselves the Lily White movement, who took over some southern state parties and tried to send all-white delegate slates to the National Convention, which picked the presidential nominees back in these days. Primaries where you vote for your nominees are actually a relatively recent contrivance, believe it or not. But they weren't seated because the National Republican Party recognized it would be a big PR black eye that they didn't need. An opportunistic Herbert Hoover did seat some of them in 1928, though, and if not for that, this wouldn't even be a canard used by anyone today. And again, if the GOP record, properly understood in context, was really that bad, why are Democrats trying to claim it while assigning the GOP the old Democrat record? In passing, I'll address the but experts say, but academic consensus among historians say, so what business do I have questioning those with credentials? First of all, anyone who has to hide behind their credentials instead of explaining what facts support their case is already in trouble. It's an ex cathedra fallacy. Also, see the Grievance Studies affair, in which James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian created a series of intentionally broken and downright hilarious papers in race and gender studies to see if any serious academic journals would publish them. It turns out they would, and intriguingly, James Lindsay said they had better luck getting their hoax papers printed once they realized social justice and wokeness was really more of a religion and wrote accordingly. James said they were a whole religious architecture, and once you framed your absurd proposal in those terms, you could get downright silly and sometimes terrifying proposals accepted by them. Now, such a prank should have won them awards rather than scorn from the Academy, and Portland State University revealed its woke captive status by opening a punitive investigation into Peter Boghossian, to say nothing of the woke captured Evergreen University and what they did aimed at Brett Weinstein. What should have inspired self-reflection and improvement instead motivated retaliation, which proves the system is broken and is no longer about honest and correct knowledge production. Academia's loss of its own internal self-corrective ability, that makes it my job as a layman to push back. It is time to push back on the academic laundering of Democrat political narratives, the academic laundering of Democrat talking points, the academic laundering of Democrat conspiracy theories, which is coasting on the institutional reputations from earlier, more serious thinkers, wielding them as a brand name to add gravitas to their present lightweight ideas. So we need to reject these quackademics, the intellectual bodyguard of the Democratic Party. So academic Democrats knew their party's past impeded its present, and they set about busily retconning their history to fit the party's future needs. Now, this is far from an outlandish conspiracy theory. They've done this before. Academic Democrats have rewritten history to help their party before. So it's not so crazy to think that they did it again. From the Lost Cause to the Dunning School to the revisionism of Professor Howard K. Beale, yes, that really was his name, The Critical Year, a study of Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction to Charles and Mary Beard's The Rise of American Civilization, sympathetic academics bent the truth. Dunning School historians said Republican-backed black rule had ruined the South until the Klan returned Democrats to power. The Critical Year spun Northern industrialists and carpetbaggers as Reconstruction's true villains, spun tariff and railroad subsidies as their weapons, and said Republican talk of equal rights was a scam, and that Southern whites, especially anti-capitalist hero Andrew Johnson, was their greatest fear. As Beale said, quote, constitutional discussions of the rights of the Negro, status of Southern states, the legal position of ex-rebels, and the powers of Congress and the President determined nothing. They were pure sham, end quote. Howard K. Beale, Critical Year, a study of Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction, published 1930, page 147. Another book, The Rise of American Civilization, told a similar story, and Beale and the Beards became friends and promoted their outlook, termed revisionism, which replaced the Dunning School and dominated until the 1950s. Charles Beard, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, 1913, maligned the founders, saying they were all rich guys pursuing their class interest, whereas, by contrast, 1619 says that they were all white slave owners installing white supremacy. Now notice how the dominant spin in the Academy always matches whatever boosts the current Democrat talking points. Funny how that works. So this academic consensus is actually just a political consensus among academics. And no matter how much the left repeats, historians agree the party's switched, all without telling you that liberals outnumber conservatives 33-1 among history professors. Yeah, we should note that part. Anyway, none of them can answer, this academic consensus canard, can't answer. One, why so few Southern Democrats at all levels of government changed parties? Two, why beliefs that the GOP held since the 1860s were suddenly called dog whistles starting in the 1960s? What caused the Democrats to start using this attack on the very same pro-capitalism beliefs that they'd never called racist before the 1960s? Three, why did the voting patterns show that the GOP's growth in the South tied to white-collar growth rather than anything civil rights related? Four, why did the supposedly conservative Jim Crow Democrats vote for Woodrow Wilson's wish list, the New Deal, and even most of the Great Society? Why did Jim Crow Democrats engage in all the same behaviors seen by non-Southern Democrats then and now in everything from massive election fraud to organized political violence to overblown rhetoric promoting hatred of capitalism? Now this hoax of switching parties, it's one that was slowly built over time. First, we have the primitive attacks, the building blocks, like the supposed Southern strategy. Basically, Eisenhower won Southern states in the 50s, which encouraged the GOP to start fielding lower-level candidates. It's called Operation Dixie. Eiley Potter, a fellow out of Virginia, was the key guy in that. And they did all this, and they explicitly say this. They got this operation started because they thought Ike's breakthrough showed that racism, the very racism that bound Southern whites to Democrats, was a fading force. And because it was a fading force, they thought they had a chance of flipping various offices in the South. So enter Joseph Alsop, who is basically an op-ed writer posing as a news columnist, who was chummy with JFK. He hosted an inauguration night party at his home that JFK attended. So this JFK buddy started writing op-eds characterizing GOP efforts as a Southern strategy, which was somehow appealing to segregationists on the basis of sly appeals to preserving segregation. Now, Alsop's columns and related acts by Arthur Kroc, they could only cite anonymous and probably fictitious GOP operatives. Sources say Russian collusion. Yeah, they've been doing that trick for a long time. A long time indeed. They couldn't produce any document or any recording to support the Republicans want segregationists story. Never mind anyone they could quote by name who said such a plan existed was not in a position to know. Alsop and JFK, and later LBJ, they needed their prepackaged narrative to invade the American mind because Democrats were already losing the South, all while the GOP promoted civil rights nationally. Absent this narrative, they'd lose the South and the pretense of a moral high ground. With it, they would have at least one. So this kind of coverage. This is the backdrop behind those polls sometimes referenced by the narrativers. The Democrats went to being, seen as the more pro-civil rights party in the 60s. Okay, it was the slanted coverage, not anything anyone did. I mean, for crying out loud, the Republicans voted more strongly for civil rights bills than Democrats. So it wasn't the way people were voting that gave people reading the news that idea. It was what the people writing the news were writing. Now, some alleged news reporters spun Goldwater and Nixon campaigns as something they weren't. But there wasn't a unified theory of party platform switching or all the racists becoming Republicans in the 60s. Indeed, you can't find a single statement, a single speech or press release or book by any civil rights leader in the 60s that claims the parties had switched, were switching, or were about to switch. So no civil rights leader claimed this. Also, the same goes for black radicals. The same goes for political scientists who are far more skeptical than the op-ed writers like Joseph Alsop or Arthur Kroc. And no one before the 1990s put this party switched tripe into a history book. Also, contemporary historians and political scientists, contemporary historians and political scientists were either non-committal, and some of them outright dismissed the idea that a race issue-induced partisan realignment in the South was taking place. Some agreed it was possible, but found the talk premature. But some of them dismissed it outright. And these authors include people like Bernard Cosman in his book 5 States for Goldwater, Donald R. Matthews and James W. Prothero in their 1966 book Negroes in the New Southern Politics. You have Bernard Cosman and Robert Huckshorn in Republican Politics, the 1964 campaign and its aftermath for the party, published 1968. You have the 1969 book by the Ripon Society, The Lessons of Victory. You got George B. Tyndall, The Disruption of the Solid South in 1972. William C. Havard, The Changing Politics of the South, 1972, although that's... Havard writes the beginning and end of that book, but it has a lot of guest essayists, including one on, I think, Alabama by Donald Strong. You'll hear that name again later. Newman v. Bartley and Hugh Davis Graham, Southern Politics in the Second Reconstruction, 1975. Lewis M. Siegel, Southern Republicanism, 1975. Now, Kevin Phillips, in The Emerging Republican Majority, 1969, he thinks voter realignment works like political astronomy, which is inevitable regardless of the candidates' schemes, while Reg Murphy and Hale Gulliver in The Southern Strategy, 1971, deem it strategy-induced, but say that it failed. They say the Southern strategy is real, but failed because the South was becoming less racist. An interpretation also endorsed by Alexander Lamas in The Two-Party South, 1984. So already you've caught these people in a narrative 180. First they say, oh, well, there was a Southern strategy, but it failed because the South became less racist. But then in the 90s, when Republicans flipped the South at the congressional and the governor's level, suddenly, well, actually, narrative pivot, the South was secretly racist the whole time, and that's why the Republicans now hold the South. So you notice that the narrative pivoted 180, but the conclusion is somehow the same because this is just some prepackaged narrative. This is a canard. This isn't something real. So busted. Now, but in any case, this thing all starts to shift. Like I said, people in the 60s who in poli-sci and history circles were very skeptical. It didn't become a majority opinion in poli-sci until the 90s. But we had people as early as Jack Bass and Walter DeVries in 76 claiming this. So they wrote a book called The Transformation of Southern Politics, 1976. They invented the notion of Goldwater as a central transformational figure and 1964 as a critical election, a view amplified later in various academic papers by Edward G. Carmines and James A. Stimson throughout the 80s, trumpeted by Alexander Lamis in 1984. Bass and DeVries also cite on pages 378 and 379 a 1975 paper by Merle Black called The Changing Regional and Partisan Bases of Congressional Support for Civil Rights Legislation, the U.S. House of Representatives, 1963 through 1972. This was delivered at a 1975 meeting of the Southern Political Science Association, and later published under a different name, The Regional and Partisan Bases of Congressional Support for the Changing Agenda of the Civil Rights Legislation. The Journal of Politics, Volume 41, number 2, May 1979, pages 665 through 679. Now, this is your earliest assertion that the party platforms on civil rights switched. He also claimed to see a hidden Northern Republican Southern strategy. So, basically, this is an unpublished paper. This unpublished paper makes its way... This unpublished paper makes its way into the Bass and DeVries' book, but on the other hand, it doesn't actually. Okay, so basically, Merle Black of Earl and Merle Black. They're twin brothers from I think East Texas originally, but Merle Black. I swear that guy is like, I don't know if you ever seen Hoodwinked. And how the detective pieces it together because, you know, all of your stories have the rabbit in it, so therefore there's your villain. Yeah, Merle Black is kind of like that. Every time some significant thing in this theory needs to be invented, he's not far away. But yeah, this idea that the party switched platforms, basically concocted and delivered in a paper in 75, mentioned in Bass and DeVries in 76, but Merle Black's actual paper is not published till 79. So basically the first that this theory escapes into the public is with Bass and DeVries in 76, if that makes sense. Anyway, Bass and DeVries, also page 10, they further the LBJ character arc, which was first seen in Murphy and Gulliver in 1971, Southern Strategy, pages 20 through 22. This in place, the LBJ character arc is the idea that he had some sort of moral reformation, which led that his party's reformation. Not a lot of evidence for that. We'll get to that later. Anyway, this in place, all that remained was for a more scientific veneer to be applied by Edward G. Carmines and James Stimson in their issue Evolution, Race and the Transformation of Southern Politics in 1989, who claimed a new kind of conservatism, which they call racial conservatism, emerged as a result of a supposed 1964 realignment. From there, most of the above and much similar literature were referenced by Thomas and Mary Edsall in their 1992 book, Chain Reaction, whereby the magical switching parties conspiracy theory made the leap from obscure political science to so-called journalism, and then Chain Reaction, in turn, was featured in the footnotes of Dan T. Carter's book, From George Wallace to Newt Gingrich, published 1996, on pages 63, 79, and 80. After entering history via Dan T. Carter, the magical switching parties conspiracy theory was built upon by Earl and Merle Black, Carrie Frederickson, Joseph Eistrup, and Kevin M. Cruz, among others. While Dan Carter's 1995 biography of George Wallace dealt only fleetingly with the subject, his 1996 work, From George Wallace to Newt Gingrich, Race and the Conservative Counter-Revolution, forcefully advanced the party realignment story. In this slim 123-page volume, Carter originated the claim that the GOP, more than making a racist appeal here and there, had an ideology it copied from George Wallace but dared not credit him for, that this politics of rage drove anti-DC establishment rhetoric, which consisted of coded racial appeals from welfare queens and colorblindness and taking the country back. From there, Earl and Merle Black again, the rise of Southern Republicans, reinterpreted non-presidential Southern elections to fit Carter's mold. And that actually was key, because otherwise all you have is pointing at a bunch of presidential campaigns. Now, the reason you wouldn't see a book like The Rise of Southern Republicans written before 1994 is because Republicans didn't control the majority of congressional seats in the South before 1994. So they couldn't have. So basically, now you need to reinterpret and pretend that race drove things other than presidential campaigns. There's Merle Black again. So they reinterpreted non-presidential Southern elections to fit Carter's mold, although it falls flat compared to the refutation offered in Byron E. Schaeffer and Richard Johnston's The End of Southern Exceptionalism in 2006. Now, Schaeffer and Johnston do some good scholarship. It's just they shouldn't have had to, because it was mostly a rediscovery of stuff that people knew at the time before these narrative pushers buried it. Anyway, piling onto Dan Carter's assertion that white supremacy adopted coded language and morphed into modern conservatism, Princeton professor Kevin M. Cruz, in between his interminable Twitter threads, named the suburbs as the origin and epicenter, picking Georgia's capital as a microcosm of this supposed event in white flight, Atlanta and the making of modern conservatism, 2005. Others added their own twist. Carrie Frederickson and the Dixiecrat Revolt and the End of the Solid South, 1932 through 1968, published 2001, claimed Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats served as a bridge to the GOP, and Joseph Eistrup in The Southern Strategy Revisited, Republican Top-Down Advancement in the South, 1996, claimed presidential campaigns trickled down racist republicanism that transformed Southern partisan control. Another detail bears mentioning, actually I think I talked about this earlier, early narratives by Murphy and Gulliver from 1971, The Southern Strategy, or Lammas, 1984, The Two-Party South, that credit declining racism for Southern GOP stagnation were discarded. The Democrat narrative needs had changed. Now the GOP won in the South because racism invisibly continued. The newly spun critical race theory happily obliged this view as it spread from law schools to colonize other disciplines and institutions. It's called praxis, yes. Critical race theory, of course, being based on Marxism. They don't view it as just a theory. They view it as something that must motivate activism, or what they call it praxis, Praxis, which when they say critical race theory isn't in schools or isn't in something else, sure it is. I mean, if you're looking at something where people say disparities are caused by discrimination and discrimination alone, things are all secretly racist and you need to be wise in this theory we're teaching in order to find it. You need to deconstruct and find the racism, and how did the racism that we're assuming is there as our premise, how did that manifest in this situation? If you start seeing words like equity, you are dealing with CRT, whether the people are pleased to call it CRT or not. You are dealing with CRT when you start seeing a certain vocabulary, diversity and equity and inclusion and white privilege and white rage and white fragility. Yeah. You can, whatever they please to call it, you recognize it by the vocabulary. Anyway, as the U.S. economy roared under Reagan, the USSR fell, which debunked the myth any viable alternative to capitalism existed. Democrats abandoned hope of retaking many Reagan Democrats, and they pivoted from class to race. Impersonating a moderate in a three-way contest, Bill Clinton won narrowly, and then lost the House for the first time in 40 years in 1994. Whatever moderation could do for Bill Clinton's re-election, it had no long-term future for Democrats. A rush to identity politics gathered steam, with the magical switching parties conspiracy theory as the noble lie undergirding it all. Thus, the magical switching parties conspiracy theory, the lie that turned millennials liberal, serves as the cover story for cancel culture, as a pretext for burning, looting, and assault, a moral cloak for slandering mundane opponents as terrifying reincarnations of Das Dritte Reich. Yet, despite the hysteria, it's not resurgent racism or fascism they fear, but majority opinion. They don't want the right-of-center majority, disturbed at the attempted remaking of America, to realize they are the majority. Democrats suppress speech, citing past evils without telling us who did them. They also slap the civil rights label on non-civil rights issues to intimidate common sense into silence. These over-leveraged underachievers need moralistic intimidation to stop a 1972 Nixon/1984 Reagan-style consensus from forming and crushing their subsidized subversion. Their fear is justified. Democrats lose the argument whenever it is allowed to happen, uncensored. For more on this, see 2016. This is why Democrats will defend the magical switching parties conspiracy theory, no matter how ridiculous it gets. The alternative is admitting their party did all these past evils, and that they used conspiracy theories to justify mob attacks on peaceful people. It means they're bad people doing bad things to good people for fake reasons. Of note, it's never the public demanding bans for conservatives, but well-funded third-party pressure groups running coordinated campaigns with sock puppet accounts. As the Hidden Tribes report explains, these progressive activists that despise free speech are no more than 8% of the public. Imagine if corporate boards knew that. Imagine if the frightened public knew that. The moment they found out, they'd dismiss the self-righteous excuses. Now, the substance of all of this, the Republicans voted more strongly for civil rights bills than Democrats, including the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and the 1972 Equal Employment Opportunity Act. The only realignment here is the Democrats realigning their narratives to fit modern demands. So, that's the introduction.